Hi, I'd like to go ahead and get started for the evening. I'm Lee Quinby, and I'd like to welcome you to the second of the Gannett Lecture Series for the spring term. Let me make a couple of announcements, first of all, and start with the interpreters tonight. Standing by me is Kathleen Graham, and she's going to be sharing her duties with Colleen Freeman. So would you please give them both a round of applause? Is anybody here for the first time? Okay, you're all regulars. That's great. So I can just go, regulars meaning you've had one lecture, I guess, at least experience. But I wanted to just go over how we're going to do the question and answers. After our speaker tonight, we'll have about 15 minutes of question and answer time. And I'll come around with a microphone, so let me know just by signaling me. I'll bring the microphone to you, and that way you'll have an opportunity to continue the discussion. And I'd also like to remind you that 2 weeks from tonight, our speaker will be Eric Liu, who will be talking about Chinese-American relations. It's a very hot topic right now, so it will be interesting to hear what he has to say. And finally, that after the question and answer period, I invite you to join us for Girl Scout cookies and punch. So it's a great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker to you. Bessie Dendrinos has brought the sunshine we're now experiencing since she's come here from Athens, and I really appreciate that. I think she gets credit for it. She's professor of sociology of language and foreign language education at the University of Athens, and I had the great fortune of meeting her there when I was at the University of Athens on a Fulbright, and I could never have found a more gracious colleague and a more generous friend. I'm pleased that I'm able to invite her now to my own home institution, even though it's a short-lived home institution at RIT. Professor Dendrinos is the author and editor of several books on the ideology of language. She has spent a great deal of her career teaching teachers of English language. And people often think about language simply as something that we use, a tool of communication. But what you'll discover tonight is that we also need to ask questions about how language uses us. That is, how it shapes our identities, our expectations, and our ways of perceiving reality. And with the forces of globalization and technology altering our relations to countries around the world, such questions about language really become paramount. These are the kinds of issues that we'll be hearing about tonight in her talk entitled Linguistic Ecology or Linguistic Eulogy. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Bessie Dendrinos.
I hope this is working. Good evening, everyone. It is a very great pleasure for me to be with you tonight and a unique opportunity. This is the first time that I have an opportunity to speak to such a diverse group of American students. In fact, I have never before spoken to a group of American students. It will be of great interest to me to try to see what your response is. And I will indeed be very happy if anyone would like to ask questions about my own institution, where conditions are quite different in Greece, in the University of Athens. It tends to share much more similarity with other European universities. American universities are very different. If any of you would like to speak with me about our experiences, I would be very happy to speak with you after this session is over. I am not a native speaker of English, and though I have been introduced as Bessie Dendrinos, my real name is Vasiliki Dendrinou. I just put that on there in case you're interested. I wonder how many of you in here speak a language other than English? Okay. Okay, well, my talk today falls within the field we call linguistics, a field which is concerned with the study of language, which is as broad and varied as our views about language. But the talk, of course, tonight, as Lee already said, is linguistic ecology or linguistic eulogy. I'm very proud of this. It's the first time that I did this kind of trick with PowerPoint, even though I've used PowerPoint before. In fact, language has been discussed and represented through linguistics in very many different ways. For example, it has been represented as a system. First of all, as a highly ordered system of patterns and units of expression tied to patterns and units of content that are used to convey meaning. In other words, a system of patterned structural relations. However, it's also been represented as a semiotic system. That is, a system of either arbitrary versus socially situated signs. In other words, as a semiotic, a symbolic system, in fact, many believe that can do more than nature can do. Also, as a semogenic, or otherwise a meaning-making system, which allows agents to be meaning makers, designers, involved in the production of meaning. It has also been represented as an object. Many believe that language is a container of meaning, or a valued possession one has the innate capacity of acquiring, or a valued object of knowledge, important symbolic or cultural capital. It has also been represented as a phenomenon, a social phenomenon, reflecting or enacting social operations, or as a cognitive phenomenon, tightly linked to the operations of the mind or the brain. It has also been represented as an instrument, a tool for the communication of ideas, or some would say of miscommunication of ideas, or a means of controlling or potentially liberating people, of establishing social relations and identity. It has also been represented as a product, a patterned behavior which can be learned and modified, or a skill to be developed. Finally, it has been represented as a living form, a type of organic existence, since we talk about the birth of language, its growth, its decline, and attrition. These are only some of the pertinent for us today ways in which language has been viewed by linguistics, a field, an academic field, which grew during the second part of the 20th century, for the most part as an apolitical discipline. It identified itself as a science, and in identifying itself as a science, mainstream linguistics in the West has been mainly concerned with the objective study of the formal properties of language, that is, its phonology, its syntax, its vocabulary. The purpose of such study was to enable linguists to describe the systematicity in particular languages like English, Greek, French, Arabic, and pave the ground for language standardization and codification. In fact, that attempt, which characterized the 19th and 20th century growing nation states, was extremely important for the homogenization of societies. That, of course, while it was extremely important for the development of the nation state, and in fact was responsible for the creation of a myth, the one language, one nation myth, at the same time silenced the heteroglossia within societies. In fact, language standardization was responsible for creating a situation in which the diversity of language within a society no longer had the status that we wanted today again to have. Because as the new millennium begins, socioeconomic factors make demands for respect of heterogeneity, expressed in the growing celebration of difference and diversity, as this is articulated in social and academic discourses. Before, what we were aiming at during the 19th and 20th centuries was primarily social, cultural, and linguistic homogeneity. As heterogeneity, linguistic, cultural, social, is taking on a greater respect and it becomes a social necessity, a substantial part of linguistic scholarship is witnessing in and or participating in a political turn. It is therefore often focusing more recently on socio-political practices enacted through language use and on the socio-political implications of the choices we make with, over, and related to languages and language varieties. My own interests in language, language study, and language education are socially and politically situated. Hence my concern to connect language with the notion of ecology. The literal meaning of the word ecology, as recorded in dictionaries, is the following. The pattern and balance of relationships between animate and inanimate objects and their environment. With this definition as a starting point, we can describe linguistic ecology as the study of the relationships between languages in the world in a national or supranational polity and or community. Linguistic ecology is not a widely used term inside or outside the discipline of linguistics. Yet it is not a new term or concept. In the 1970s, bilingual studies scholar Einar Hagen was arguing that just as ecosystem ecology is a movement for environmental sanitation, linguistic ecology should be concerned with the cultivation and preservation of languages. In the 1990s, the Australian sociolinguist Peter Mühlhauser argued in favor of linguistic ecology and against linguistic imperialism in the Pacific region, where the rate of language attrition has been extremely significant. Numerous other linguists in different parts of the world, including the United States, have been keenly interested in language preservation and have expressed great concern about the linguistic devastation we're witnessing. I should say here that when I am referring to linguistic devastation, this also includes sign languages, which also we experience the same kind of language attrition, meaning in relation to sign languages as well. We are in fact losing dozens of languages every 30 years, and given conditions of globalization, it is predicted that in the next 100 years, over 50% of the world's languages may be dead. This is one of the points in the title of my talk, which I hope we'll get at the end of today's session, the polysemic reading that I intended to have. With it, one of my aims is to pose the question whether we will prevent or continue to contribute to language death. The use of the word eulogy here is a metaphor for death, and we will see other kinds of metaphors as the talk continues. The world languages are unequally distributed for reasons which are socio-historically significant. As we can see in Table 1, the least linguistically diverse parts of the world are Europe and North America. In Europe and the Middle East, we have only 4% of world languages. In the Americas, North, Central, and South, only 15%. And in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, we have 81% of the world's languages. In those parts of the world where we find the greatest linguistic diversity, we experience also, unfortunately, the greatest language loss. All in all, it might be of interest to you to know that languages are becoming extinct at twice the rate of endangered mammals and 4 times the rate of endangered birds. For those of you who are particularly interested, you can find relevant information at Ethnologue at this particular address. Now, despite the rate of language extinction, concern for linguistic conservation and pluralism does not seem to be widespread enough so as to trigger rigorous efforts to understand in which ways linguistic diversity is valuable and what riches are lost every time a language dies out. Nevertheless, as Nicholas Ostler of the Foundation for Endangered Languages notes, the success of humanity in colonizing the planet has been due to our ability to develop cultures suited for survival in a variety of environments. When language transmission itself breaks down, there's always a large loss of inherited knowledge. Of course, the language in crisis issue is not all about small, indigenous, endemic languages. In fact, futurists predict that it is possible, if we do not take positive action and continue with our negative intervention, that the world of the future could be dominated by a dozen or fewer languages. Even strong national languages with long history and inherited wisdom are at risk. This is a point in case in the European Union, deeply involved with the unequal distribution of cultural and linguistic power today. Some of my own work has this problem as one main point of reference, and so does the work of 2 other European scholars, the Finn, Tove Skutnap-Kangas, and the Brit, Robert Philipson. Both of them have used the term linguistic ecology as a central concept in their writings related to European and world language politics, and have joined other linguistic human rights activists in pleas for linguistic diversity in the world. Sympathetic toward the ideological and political implications of the work, I use the term linguistic ecology today, coining alongside it the term I fabricated, linguistic eulogy, thus making a play on words and therefore on meanings, on the denotations and connotations of both constructs. Dictionaries generally define eulogy as high praise of someone or something. When we eulogize people or things, we praise them very much. Linguistic eulogizing, therefore, can refer to or be connected with the special valuing of language, that is, understanding it as an extremely valuable possession of peoples and of communities, as an undeniable human right. Japanese scholar Yokio Tsuda, who has built an ecology of language paradigm, explains that the struggle for linguistic rights represents an attempt to harness fundamental principles and practices employed in the field of human rights. This way, we may honor our civic responsibilities. I'm referring to the responsibilities we have as citizens of linguistically and culturally diverse communities, whether we recognize it or not. Most of our communities today, because of the economic migration, are, like in the past in history, linguistically and culturally diverse. In some nation states, it is a political decision to decide not to recognize that linguistic and cultural diversity. It is our civic responsibility also as members of a world that does retain some of its abundant linguistic and cultural wealth. I should perhaps note here, and I would have liked to have muted this, but this is not on. I will continue. I wanted to note, as I'm saying this, that language is among the 4 original basic characteristics cited in Article 13 of the United Nations Charter, where signatories commit themselves to promoting universal respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, religion, or language. Another component of Tsuda's, the scholar that I mentioned, the Japanese scholar that I mentioned before, Ecology of Language Paradigm, is that participants in communication should be in a position of equality, irrespective of their mother tongue, gender, race, color, or other distinctions. Of course, what we mean by equality in communication and freedom of expression, whether in educational, professional, or other social settings, refers to the equal chances of quality participation of people within and across communities, as well as to equal access of information. This, of course, in most nation states is not possible. It is not possible for everyone to have equal access to information and equal participation in communication within society, merely because of the standardization of language and also because there is the recognition of one national language. And within education and public services, most frequently we find the use of simply the national language, rather than also minority languages and also variations of the standard language being used. Philipson, the British scholar that I mentioned before, has posited the ecology of language paradigm against the diffusion of English paradigm. The paradigm, which entails commonsensical arguments for legitimizing English as an international language and English discursive practices as those that have global value. In fact, as the only ones that have global value. But human rights, says Philipson, and I agree, are meaningless if they do not apply to speakers of all languages. The development for arguments to strengthen the power of English as an international language, rather than to support world plurilingualism, paves the ground for what some have viewed as linguistic imperialism and others as linguistic colonialism. However, because the exportation of language involves exportation of particular forms of culture and knowledge, as well as the creation of economic and political elites, And because the internationalization of a language entails economic and political advantages, English has been marketing itself as an international, as a global language, facilitating globalization on the way. And it has been done through commonsensical arguments. It is not only native speakers, whatever that means, of English, people whose first language is English, that feel it's natural for everyone in the world to speak English and expect it, whether they are in their own country or elsewhere. But also, for speakers of other languages, they have come through the marketization of English, and it is a big industry, to consider that it is natural for everyone to speak English. An excellent example of English language promotionism, as I call it, by the British, is a recent publication by a linguist called David Gradle, and he has been commissioned by the British Council, an institution whose important mission, in fact, is to sell English as a world commodity. And it is a book which I have noted down here for you. It is called The Future of English, English 2000, and it has extremely interesting descriptions for those of you and predictions in relation to how English will colonize the world, in fact. And English promotionism, which is, as I said, the basic duty of the British Council around the world, has a number of sites on the internet that you could perhaps visit. Now, the cultural politics of English as a global language is an interesting area in itself, and it involves, in fact, eulogizing practices that some scholars, including myself, have felt the need to critique. So, in the sense I have just discussed, the concept of linguistic eulogy, which is part of the title of my talk, as a single language eulogy, comes in sharp conflict with the notion of linguistic ecology. It can, however, also be synonymous with it if we think of it as valuation of languages. As a matter of fact, linguistic eulogizing can have positive but also negative overtones, as I will proceed to argue. We can talk about linguistic ecology as We can talk about linguistic eulogy as linguistic ecology. We can talk about it as linguistic social justice, and I will proceed to do that. We can also talk of linguistic eulogy as recognizing the linguistic turn in our information age or overemphasizing it. In overemphasizing the linguistic turn in our information age, I will be arguing that this has a negative overtone. And negative overtones are also the linguistic eulogizing, which can lead to linguistic nationalism, linguistic socialism, linguistic determinism, and finally, as a weapon for linguistic warfare. And we will be seeing that. First, I should like us to look at the linguistic eulogy as linguistic ecology configuration, which has as its basis the value of language, or better yet of languages. It points to arguments of movements, first of all, to recognize multilingualism, multiculturalism, as the natural state of word order. And it has always in history, that's the way it has been. There had always been a multilingual, multicultural state of world affairs. The second, to capitalize on plurilingualist, pluriculturalist principles and use these principles in education and training. These are preconditions for both democratic citizenship and employability in this age of information, which has entailed an important language turn since now, more than ever before, all production is mediated by language. Also, to develop a plurilingual ethos of communication, you may not recognize this term. It is a term, when we talk about ethos, it is the way that we are used to operating. It is a way of existing in our everyday communication with other people. It is a term which has been coined by an Indian scholar, Lakshman Kubchantani, that has been trying to promote the kind of plurilingual ethos of communication which has existed for centuries in India, and where people do have a totally different way of facing language and communication. Also, to protect the many languages and cultures in the world which are endangered or already dying out, and therefore to protect the wealth of knowledge and ideas stored in each of these languages. As has already become evident from what I have discussed so far, linguistic ecology is in various ways related to social justice that I mentioned before. But to think of language linked with social justice means that we shift our attention from the connection between linguistic diversity and biodiversity to the connection between language and social values. It requires that we focus on the social nature of language and to the importance of its social functions. Because to think of language in connection with social justice entails considering the conditions provided by various institutions of society so that its members participate constructively in all its operations, to have equal access to all forms of knowledge and equal chances for the development of skills required in the type of civility we envision for the 21st century. And these conditions most definitely have a serious language base, since it is by using language that we may access knowledge, mediate production, and generally participate in all social operations. In this sense, we can perhaps understand linguistic eulogy as linguistic social justice, which in my mind minimally refers to the following: to actively respect people's rights to knowledge and education in their mother tongue. The United States and Great Britain are two nations which have not created conditions so that linguistic minorities may receive education in their mother tongue. This is true of many other societies, particularly in Australia and Northern European societies, where immigrant populations or minority populations can receive education, access to knowledge, in other words, in their mother tongue. They access knowledge about and part of the curriculum which other students receive, but particularly in their first years of education in primary school, they do receive that education through their mother tongue. Also, to actively respect others' linguistic and sociocultural habitus. Habitus, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term. It is a term coined by Pierre Bourdieu, a sociologist, a French sociologist. It is, I use this as a concept to mean, however, in very simplistic terms, our daily habits, the way that we have been used to operating with our body as well as with our language, our facial expressions, our whole way of communicating. I find, and I have been told, that in switching from one language to another, I myself have a totally not only different persona and identity, different kinds of expression, facial expressions, movements, and so on and so forth. Of course, even in relation to not only posture of my body, but also how close I get to people, because different languages entail different also proximity in relation to language. And this is a field that some people have studied, language proxemics, it is called, or communication proxemics. The third, to promote linguistic democratization so that all members of society have access to information, the right to fair treatment by the law, the judicial, the medical systems, which most frequently, again, is not the case. In Greece, for example, where we are witnessing more recently, Greece used to be a very homogenized society with the movements of population, particularly in the European Union. We are experiencing the influx of economic immigrants, and therefore, with the diversity of languages which has risen tremendously in recent years, in my own country, we have not created conditions for people that are immigrant populations, rightfully so. They live and they work in Greece. We have not created conditions so that when they go to hospitals, when they receive medical treatment, when they are in various social services, to have the possibility of communicating in their own language. And this is true, of course, very much so also in the United States, with the exception perhaps of Spanish, which is recognized as a big language, and therefore some of the things are translated and so on and so forth. And finally, to promote equal linguistic treatment of people, that is to promote the use of anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-linguicist, anti-nationalist language, and so on and so forth. I don't know how many of you have ever heard the word anti-linguicist or linguicist practices, which is a term that some people have been using, and it is equivalent to racist or sexist, other isms of that sort. The last point on this list raises a question of a different nature than what I have dealt with so far. For while it is possible to consciously try to refrain from saying sexist things about someone, or from making racist remarks about someone and so on, it is much more difficult to deal and combat the sexism, racism, etc., encoded in and construed by language itself. This last remark brings me to one more view to be added to the list of views I showed you earlier, the view of language as a social semiotic, which language refers to a certain reality, and that is its ideational function. It expresses reality, and that is its interpersonal function, and it creates metaphors of reality. That means its textual function. In other words, we could say that language is the way we make meaning of the world and our experiences as individual agents and as social subjects. In fact, I would say that we actually language reality by expressing it, by referring to it, and by constructing metaphors for it. By adopting this view, we understand that language does not simply reflect social and physical reality, but that it encodes it, it construes it, it reproduces and can potentially alter it. In fact, it is exactly because this is so, it is because language does not reflect our experience of what is out there by correspondence with the categories of the material world. It does not correspond by correspondence with the categories, that by working on language, we can try to subvert the existing order, a social order which is dominated by gendered, racist, nationalist, linguicist ideologies. This is exactly what we do when we intervene, not simply in language use, but also when we plan the lexicogrammar of a language to combat social wrongs. This is what we've done trying to correct sexist language. For example, in trying to not use the pronoun he in a generalization to refer to both sexes. Think, for example, of the efforts to deal with the grammar, and particularly the vocabulary, which is either derogatory or exclusionary for particular social groups, that particular languages represent as deviant, abnormal, and subordinate. Socially unjust linguistic and social constructions and representations through language have been at the center of some sociopolitically sensitive linguistic scholarship in recent years. In fact, my own most recent article regarding linguistic racism in foreign language education discourse appears in a book that was just published in Vienna entitled The Semiotics of Racism, Approaches and Critical Discourse Analysis. This particular paper has been reproduced in a book that is entitled The ELT, The Politics of ELT, and I have brought to give to Lee so that she can give it to the library in case someone is interested in this, of how language itself, what kind of racism is language racism, which is different from the racism that we're used to talking about. However, there are still far too few studies in the international linguistic scene that show, through systematic analysis of data, how various languages are in fact exclusionary, and what an important role the lexicogrammar of a language plays in reinforcing aspects of culture which we often find alarming. Allow me, however, at this point to say and clarify that as I make this claim, I don't wish to make a statement which would be qualified as linguistic determinism. I don't mean that language determines reality. It does, however, provide us with a number of options to make transformations of reality, or rather, transformations of our experience of reality, as critical language analysis shows that our language choices are, in fact, ideologically bound. Consider, for example, the following newspaper titles of articles reporting on the same event. Now, the titles that I have chosen here are from various newspapers, and they're articles, all of them, covering an event of civil disorder in pre-independence Zimbabwe in June 1975. So all of what you will see here are different kinds of titles of the same event. Okay, the first one, police shoot 11 dead in Salisbury riot. As you see here, the police is agent in this particular sentence. We know who has shot, who, not exactly whom, okay, but we know who has done the shooting, and we know in what kind of circumstance. However, this is a very different kind of title. We have the riots in Salisbury. We have no agent. We don't know who did what to whom. The only thing we know is that there were riots in Salisbury, okay? Here's a third title. Africans are shot dead in Salisbury riot. Here we have a passivization in the sentence, meaning that it's a passive construction, and we have no agent here. We don't know who did the shooting. Here's another interesting variation, or a different classification or transformation of reality, as I said before. 11 Africans die in riot. We don't know whether they were shot. They may have died on their own. Okay, and this is a different kind of, again, transformation of reality. The death, which is featured here at the very beginning of the sentence, of 11 Africans, triggers further wave of violence, which is interesting We don't know whether it was the shooting that triggered violence. It is the death that triggered violence. And finally, in a different newspaper, Police Murders Zimbabweans, where for the first time we have the appearance of Zimbabwe here, and of course a very, very different transformation of reality. I'm sure that if we tried to guess which of these newspapers is sympathetic towards the people who were shot and the police, we would readily be able to guess. But these things we usually get in newspapers and news on an everyday level, and we're not really conscious of them. We were recently in Greece. It was extremely interesting with the war in Yugoslavia. It was very interesting for us to receive the news from Greek television, which was much more sympathetic to the Yugoslavian war for a whole variety of reasons. And then on the other hand, we got news from CNN and from other stations, and we were able to see the transformations of that reality to an extreme, which was tremendously interesting. And we come across this all the time. Each language also provides systematic options for the classification of reality. For example, in some languages, some things are classified in the category of possession, things we own, whereas in other languages they are not. In English, for instance, one may say, I'd like to have 2 children. But in Greek, we cannot say that. The lexicogrammar does not allow it. We can say, and I translate, I'd like to do 2 children. Or I'd like to make 2 children, but not I'd like to have. Likewise, in English and other Western languages, but not in many non-Western languages, time is classified as a thing one can possess, as a type of scroll which unrolls from past to future and future to past. I think, for example, of the present progressive in English, which shows this kind of progression of scroll. By the way, in many, many Western languages as well as non-Western languages, there's no tense as the present progressive. I'm not sure whether everybody understands what present progressive is or present continuous. I'm walking now, okay? There's no tense like that. We say we walk now or we walked yesterday, but not I am walking, and signaling what is happening in the particular instance. And time is enshrined in the tense system of English and every other language, in fact. There are languages that do not signal future, for example, in their tense system at all. For example, in Finnish and Turkish, we do not have the future put into the tense system. It is signaled perhaps with words, but not in the tense system itself. It is, of course, time is encoded in different parts of the lexicogrammar also. And as I said, time for English is the sequential order of activities, but also it is clock time as control over nature, clock time as social control, clock time as measure of labor, and time as timing. It would be interesting for you if you took some of these concepts and tried to see how, through analyzing languages, anything that we say about time, it will fall within these categories. In fact, time is our possession in English. Wait, something happened here. Yep. Sorry. Oh, something has happened and it does not show. Sorry for this. We tried it yesterday and it was okay. I don't know why it won't show. Yeah, but it has erased part of the... I just wanted to say, and what was on here, just to say that time is our possession. What I wanted to say is that the kind of things that we say about time have to do with, for example, we pass time, we save time, we waste time. In order to be able to do that, we have... it doesn't show in here. Okay, sorry. Okay, we own time, we possess it, and therefore we spend it like money, but we also have a metaphor for money being money. We fill it up and divide it up. We time people and things. Now, these seem very, very natural things for us when we are talking in English, but other languages do not talk about time like this. You cannot say in Greek, we can say some of the similar things, but we could not possibly fill up time in Greek. Okay. In many other non-Western languages, the concept of time as it is encoded in language is just totally different. The view of language that I'm adopting here is that the lexical grammar provides users with the potential, the systemic options, which resonate with the prevailing patterns of culture because language and culture co-evolve. These options are then taken up as the most frequent ones in everyday discourse, and then this feature is reinforced as part of the grammar. This is true with regard to our ecological consciousness, or should I say our anti-ecological consciousness, our disregard within our language with regard to our ecosystem. If we look at the options offered to us by English and other Western languages via the transitivity system of our languages, that part of grammar that construes our experience as a process, we will see that human beings, animates, always have an active and agentive role, whereas other elements of our ecosystem do not. Systematic investigation of the English language provides data showing that in English, inanimates are acted upon but do not themselves act. The table does not move by itself, nor does the fire in the fireplace. We move the table and we burn ourselves with a fire in the fireplace. The only environment where inanimates regularly figure as agents is in catastrophic contexts, where, if they are big enough, they can become actors in the destroy subcategory of the process. For example, the earthquake destroyed the city. Here we see the inanimate, the earthquake, being an actor. Or the fire damaged the roof. Not the fire in the fireplace, the big fire. Or the branch fell on the car. The grammar does not present objects as doers, certainly not in ongoing, constructive, or conservative processes. In English, if I say of an inanimate object, what's it doing? It means, why is it there? Remove it. So, what's that forest doing implies clear it. We don't expect an answer such as that the forest is stopping flooding, for example. The grammar makes it hard for us in English to take seriously the notion of inanimate nature as an active participant in events. Furthermore, English grammar makes a sharp dichotomy not merely between human and non-human, but also between conscious and non-conscious. There are entities in English that are treated or represented as endowed with consciousness and others as not. English conducts this dichotomy everywhere in the grammar, the most obvious one being the pronoun system, where conscious things are he or she, and unconscious things are it. This is, of course, not true in languages such as Greek, French, Italian, Spanish, and so on. More far-reaching is the fundamental distinction made by the grammar of mental processes, where the censor, the one that senses, is always a conscious being. Thus, a clear line is drawn between entities that understand, hold opinions, have preferences, etc., and those that do not. Non-conscious entities cannot be a source of information, but they cannot project, a source of information, but they cannot project an idea. For example, in English we can say, my watch says it's 7:30, but not my watch thinks it's 7:30. This binary theory of phenomena, encoded and construed in language, imposes a strict discontinuity between ourselves and the rest of creation. Of course, such conceptualization totally excludes the concept of Gaia, the word for earth, as a conscious being. English grammar does not allow us to accept the planet Earth as a living entity that not only breathes, but feels and even thinks. An entity that maintains its own body temperature despite massive changes in the heat that it receives from the sun, an entity that would inevitably die slowly as each of the living species that compose her, and I use this her rather than it, because Gaia in Greek mythology was a female. So as the living species that compose her are destroyed and that die faster as we, the animate, the conscious entities who grammatically have the prerogative to act over her, conspire to killing its organic matter. Hundreds, most probably thousands of examples could be provided through much needed linguistic analysis to show how grammar in English and other Western languages represent human beings and only some animals, the ones that we have as pets, as the only ones able to act, sense, think. And of course it is only human beings who have the possibility and the prerogative to control. We are the ones to control time, to control natural phenomena, the life on the planet. In the sense discussed here then, I suggest that we view the notion of linguistic ecology in a different perspective than that which frequents the relevant literature. Whereas the term linguistic ecology is commonly used to refer to arguments and political action for language preservation and linguistic human rights, I would like us also to view it as the systematic critique of language for its anti-ecological inscriptions and as the attempt to produce rewritings of our own statements in ecologically sensitive ways. In other words, in ways whereby it would be appropriate for us to respond to a question such as, what is that forest doing, with answers such as the following. It's holding water in store. It's cleansing and moisturizing the atmosphere. It's stopping flooding that I mentioned before. It's stabilizing the atmosphere. It's harboring life forms. Of course, in order to intervene with language in socially meaningful ways, We have to have a theory whereby language is not viewed as a system of arbitrary signs, nor a container of meaning, but itself a meaning-making system. Now, having focused up until now on the value of language and spoken about language matters, I will claim as I come toward the end of my talk now that language matters. It does matter. Language is a symbolic cultural capital of great value, but its value is not inherent. It is value that we attach to it, and our attitudes to language are what give it its value. These attitudes, socio-historically and culturally situated, can have positive or negative overtones, as I mentioned before, positive or negative consequences. Turning our attention to language and recognizing the importance of inter- and intra-linguistic diversity does have positive overtones in ways that we already discussed. In other words, it is positive to think of linguistic diversity, but cherishing language too much can also lead to its mythologization with negative overtones. As I mentioned before, it is by valuing language as a symbol of ethnic and cultural national identity that we have practiced linguistic nationalism and linguistic ethnocentrism. It is through linguistic eulogization that we have taken part in language wars and language politics, to use the title of a recent book, by the way, of a French scholar, Jean-Louis Calvet, translated and published in English in 1998. Wars that result in victories and defeats, conquest and subjugation, wars in which the languages involved are actual opponents. In the book that I mentioned before, David Graddle's Future of English, he actually posits and talks about what kind of rivals English is going to have in the future. Many linguistic cultures or linguistic communities, to mention a few more constructs of our own making, have been involved in all sorts of myth-making about their language and language in general. Myths which have entailed attaching to language aesthetic, religious, and many other qualities. The Arab world, for example, has a common myth of the sacredness of the Arabic language, which Arabs view as timeless and superior to any other language, as do Greeks and the French about the French language. The Japanese carry on the modern myth of Nihongo, the myth about Japanese being the purest language and Japanese being not merely a language, but a way of life. Moving on to another point, linguistic eulogizing supports concepts of linguistic determinism and linguistic socialism. In other words, it conspires with truth claims that language is responsible for the creation of all thought and emotion. That which cannot be spoken, cannot be felt, cannot be there as an idea. It nurtures simplistic exaggerations that linguistic cleansing for social purposes, that is gender fair and race-free language use, for example, will in itself bring social justice. The type of linguistic cleansing I'm referring to right here refers to a recent book published by British scholar Deborah Cameron, whose title is Verbal Hygiene, by the way. And she is ironic about this kind of linguistic cleansing that we have supported. Finally, overemphasis of the value of language turns our attention away from other modes of communication. And language is not the only mode of communication. And this has been particularly true in educational settings where we have given so much value to the verbal mode of communication, to language, that this is the only mode that is actually used in classrooms through our readings and so on and so forth. But as we move on in the 21st century, the semiotic landscape is increasingly multimodal. And the kind of literacies that need to be developed for participatory citizenship should take into account not only the linguistic, but also the visual, spatial, gestural, and audio modes of communication. In fact, most of our texts anymore are tending to be multimodal, in other words, to combine all of these modes of communication. In doing so, this issue is quite complicated and there's no time to go into it, but it's particularly interesting. However, we are coming to the close of the talk right now, and in doing so, I want to refer back to the title of my talk, which posed the question, linguistic ecology or linguistic eulogy, and say that I hope that it has become evident that this is a false question. Language matters are in fact so complicated that it is by no means fruitful to take an either-or position. It is perhaps more constructive when dealing with language issues to be prepared to enter the terrain of what Lee Quimby might call linguistic skepticism. And as I say this, I'm sure that I need not explain that my proposal is not an act of civility to Lee Quimby, whose work, by the way, has given me great insight into American culture, and I thank her for this publicly. In fact, as I do come to a close, I do want to thank you for being such an attentive audience and making me feel comfortable listening to me. And besides Lee Quimby, I would like to thank Rochester Institute of Technology for inviting me here. And this has been a unique opportunity, a first. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for the talk. And while we're thanking people, I also want to say thank you to Diane Hope, Kern Professor of Communications, for co-sponsoring this talk.
Here it is. Now they put it on.
So gather your thoughts and raise your hands so that I know where to bring the microphone to. Okay, hang on just a second.
Thank you. You were speaking about English, the English language somehow becoming a monopoly in the global community, that it's sponsored and endorsed all over the world as English text only. Like it's more prevalent to learn English. You have to learn English to come to school in this country or so forth. What about English evolution of language, like the language of our generation and how it isolates past generations and other people that learn proper English, whether it be in Europe or other countries? They come here, they don't know the euphemisms and the slang. Is that part of this process of either the ecology or the eulogy of the language?
Well, I'm not sure that I understand your question totally, but first of all, it's a whole issue to talk about proper English or whatever other language, okay? Language does evolve, co-evolve with the culture. Therefore, it would be totally unthinkable, even though through the kinds of things that we have learned in schools primarily about language and the myths that exist around us, we tend to think that there's a proper way of talking, a proper English, a proper French, a proper Spanish, and so on and so forth. There is no proper something. As culture evolves, language evolves with it to respond to the needs. And as language change, which is the most natural phenomenon ever, it occurs in all societies. To think of a proper kind of English or whatever other language is to try to kind of make language stay still in time. And not only still in time, but to have a kind of homogeneous language that wipes out almost all other varieties of language that naturally exist in a particular society, of course much more across societies. And English is a language, because it is a language spoken by, in many, many countries, more countries than other languages. We now have not English, we are tending to talk about Englishes. And this, in fact, lexicogrammatically is a new term. Before, we used to talk about English. Now we talk about Englishes. We don't talk about Greeks or Spanishes, despite the fact that Spanish, for example, is spoken differently, and it does exist in different sorts of countries. So English has developed differently in Australia, in the United States, in Britain, in New Zealand, in South Africa, and so on, in India, and so on and so forth. In countries where English is a first language or a second language, let alone the Englishes that are developing from populations that speak English as a foreign language, not only as a second language, but also as a foreign language. In fact, part of the promotionism, and through the British Council, I recently had, this is much better. It was coming right into my eyes. I recently heard a linguist who was commissioned again by the British Council to do talks around European countries. There's a big thing about promoting English in the European Union, because of course it would be to the advantage of England if English were the single language that was used in the European Union for basic communication. Okay, it would not wipe out other languages, but people could use those languages in their own countries and then use English as a contact language. And of course it would be of a great advantage to England, who makes billions of AQ, that's the European currency, every year from the sales of all kinds of commodities that are associated with the use of English. Only, for example, the billions of AQ that is spent on producing textbooks for the teaching of English, or electronic materials and so on and so forth that are sold all over the world. So because it is to the benefit economically of English to become a world commodity, it is more and more promoting itself not as a language that has a proper use, okay? It is now within the cultural politics of English to talk about Englishes as it develops in various parts of the world. Of course, it will take a very, very long time for us to learn to think about language differently, because we've lived so long with the construct of a pure, good, proper language with a proper grammar, whatever that means. What it meant, basically, was what I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, that as language planners actually standardized language and codified it so as to make, one, that language that is described in the grammars that we get. But that was never a language that people spoke. That was a language which was created as a standard language by linguists, by those awful people, by grammarians that silenced that living heteroglossia in a sense. But it was necessary because homogeneity was necessary. Now, as things begin to change, we have to find different ways of dealing with it, even though it is not easy. It was very, very easy to have a standard, common language that one could always refer to. Okay, but we've got to find other ways to respond to diversity as well. I don't know if that answered your question. It was a long...
Hi. First of all, I compliment you on your English. English as a second language. It's very impressive. I think that's one of the biggest things that's lacking in this country, is that we don't branch out and learn a second language. My question, or my idea rather, is in this era of globalization where technology is allowing us to basically become one world, don't you feel that it's kind of important that we change from this world of so many languages that we all cannot communicate. We cannot all share our ideas with every single person on this planet. Isn't it possible that the natural progression and the advancement of humanity is that we should have one global language, that we should all be able to communicate with one another?
Well, that is a very important question that you're asking, and this is the argument. I mean, this is what is being argued right now. And when I mentioned the diffusion of English paradigm as opposed to the language as ecology paradigm, this is again what it is posed, and it's a very, very complicated issue. Of course it is very convenient to have a single language to communicate with. But that would mean that in order for peoples around the world to learn English, they would never learn it as well as those who are native speakers of English, whose first language is English. I'm not sure how aware the audience is of how difficult it is to actually learn another language and to speak it in the way, for example, that I speak it, and which I have maintained. I have lived in the United States for a period of time. I did my postgraduate studies here. I also did a bit of my secondary school here, which allowed me also to become a near native speaker in this sense. And I also use English. I'm from the Faculty of English Studies, and we use English in order to teach our students. I mean, it is the language through which they access their information, and that helps me maintain it. But still, there are a lot of things that even I, who use English so well, cannot compare to a person who speaks English as a first language. Okay. Now, imagine all of those other people. Either we would, learning a language is also being acculturated in that language in many ways. In order to be able to adopt all the discursive practices, language is not only about vocabulary and grammar in the sense that I was talking or what we've learned in school. It is using that lexicogrammar in ways that are discursively appropriate. In order to do that, you've got to develop a whole way of thinking, a whole way of dealing with the world, a whole perception of the world. Okay. Now, in order to have equal access and equality in communication, you would have to have that if there was one single language. On the other hand, if there were languages which were simply contact languages, okay, and it could be fewer, but there were really a linguistic respect to that linguistic diversity, it would mean a wide variety of things. For example, one of the things that I'm arguing in my own work is, and I have been teaching, I have been dealing a lot with future teachers of English. I would never say, not only because I would lose my job, I would never say that English should not be taught, and it is a language which is taught very widely, the most widely taught foreign language in the world right now, even though I did have some information that I didn't have time to go into. English is not, as it is presented very frequently, as the number one language of first language speakers. It is, I think that Chinese has about